Welcome to Weaving Paths.
Bienvenido a Tejiendo Caminos.
Bem-vindos a Tecendo Caminhos,
a podcast brought to you by the EULAS Jean Monnet Network, which looks at the bi-regional relations between Latin America, the Caribbean, and the European Union. In this episode, we are absolutely delighted to hear from Dr. Alan Leal, an economist and researcher. Alan holds a PhD in economic theory from the University of Sao Paulo. His research focuses on international trade, deforestation, climate policy, and the political economy of environmental regulation, using tools such as computable general equilibrium models and game theory. He has worked extensively at the interface between academic research and policy, including projects on deforestation and trade, Brazil's accession to the OECD from an environmental perspective, and applied economic analysis for public institutions in Brazil. He is currently a senior analyst at the Climate Policy Initiative at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. In parts of this episode, we refer to Alan's working paper on whether the EUDR has yet to alter deforestation or land use patterns in Brazil. And in very exciting news, since we recorded this conversation just a few weeks ago, this paper has now been published. So we'll be sure to add that to the description for you to read more about this comprehensive study. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Alan Leal. Welcome to the EULAS Weaving Paths Podcast, Alan. Great to meet with you today.
Hi, Emily. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Wonderful to have you. So, you've studied how the EU rules often influence what happens far beyond Europe, what people call the Brussels effect. Two recent examples are the EUDR, that is the Regulation on Deforestation-Free Products, and CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. For those who are not so familiar, could you explain briefly what these are and what kind of impact they might have on trade between Europe and Latin America?
Yeah, sure. So these two regulations aim to the same goal, which is decreasing emissions, CO2 emissions, but they operate through different channels, and there are regulations related to trade. So there are trade regulations that aim to decrease emissions. CBAM is Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, aims to level the playing game across European Union producers and other producers outside the European Union. And one might ask how this game is not equal. So inside the European Union, we have what we call the emissions trade schemes, the ETS. These schemes basically aims to set forth carbon market. So if I emit a lot of CO2, I might buy from someone who is not emitting too much CO2 to have the right to emit this much CO2. And this ETS, this mechanism, operates for some markets, such as fertilizers, electricity, among other goods and sectors. This ETS, this mechanism, is already in place in Europe for several years. However, there was a concern by the European Union that this mechanism created a difference of competition, a difference of the ability to European producers to compete against foreign producers, because they would pay carbon prices, and Brazilian producers, American producers, Japanese producers wouldn't pay these prices. So CBAM tries to equalize, to fix that difference in prices. So that's exactly how the CBAM does that. So it expands this carbon market to other countries, not just the European Union, and to some sectors. It's not as widespread for all sectors in all economies. So as examples, we have electricity, fertilizers, among other goods. So I think the main lesson about CBAM is that it is a price mechanism. So you put price for something to enter, some good to enter into the European Union. That's the logic. And this price is correlated with the price that the European Union has inside it for that given. So that's what CBAM is about. The EUDR, the European Union Anti-Deforestation Regulation, aims to decrease the European Union fingerprint in deforestation. Okay, that's a nice and short definition, but what is fingerprint? What we're talking about? Like, okay, is Spain the first thing? An area that there's no forests? That's not exactly what this is about. A fingerprint is how much something's bad in the good that you import. For instance, if Germany imports Brazilian meat produced in the south of the Amazon region, and this region deforested to produce this meat, we usually say that in economics there is like an embed deforestation that accompanies that meat. So the fingerprint is exactly this concept. So although Germany is not deforesting when it imports meat from Brazil, that meat might be produced in recently deforested areas, and we have this connection about Portugal inducing deforestation here in Brazil. EUDR forbids deforestation after December 2020 for all countries in the collection of goods such as coffee, meat, cocoa, among other goods. So both regulations, CBAM and EUDR, aims to decrease the European Union fingerprint and emissions. CBAM more explicitly because we're putting a price on the carbon market, on carbon emissions, and EUDR indirectly because you're putting a sort of price on deforestation. But instead of being a price in the sense that you can decrease quantities imported, you either can import something or you don't. So these two regulations are really ambitious. They are trade-based regulations, and they're really powerful regulations. CBAM is already in place in the European Union, so it's already have an effect since this month, January 2026. However, UDR, it's not having its effect already. It had two delays. First, it was supposed to start to have its effect in December 2024, and it was delayed, postponed to December 2025, and now it's delayed once again to December 2026. And it will start with large exporters in December 2026, and in July 2027 to medium and small exporters. So there's a window, a holy window of implementation of this regulation. Both regulations will have impact on trade patterns across the globe, not just in the European Union. And we can also expect impact on prices. So there is this perception that it's really worthy to export to European Union because there is a premium to the European Union imports. So Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, among the 27 countries in the European Union, they pay a lot more to import a good from Brazil, from Indonesia, from Malaysia, and that also justifies in a way the why many countries are willing to comply with the European Union's regulations. Um, so my main message regarding this question is CBAM is a price trade mechanism. UDR is a non-price, a non-tariff mechanism, and they operate in different ways. They have the same ultimate goal, decrease emissions, but they go about achieving this goal in different ways.
That's super interesting. And you've also written a lot on how these European rules play out on the ground, or in the case of the EUDR, I guess, like how it will play out. Um, and your research specifically on how the EUDR affects, or again, will affect or continue to affect forest producers in Mato Grosso, which is a large state in Brazil. From that local perspective, how are Latin American producers feeling the impact of these new regulations?
So my work with Ana Flávia Trevisan and Victor was about how small producers in the Mato Grosso state, which is this really big state in the Brazilian Midwest, and it's also a huge producer of soybeans or corn, how they perceived the European Union the first anti-deforestation regulation. So they at first felt that this regulation was about a top-down mechanism by which the European Union was trying to coerce them into compliance. However, I would also argue, Emily, that these regulations has different models of implementation across different countries and cultures. So, for instance, we in our study we analyzed the mostly soybeans farmers. And we know that there are technologies in places to tracking. And it's also interesting to mention that EUDR is about tracking anti-deforestation. There is a due diligence procedure about, okay, Alan, I am a producer of coffee. I didn't deforest it after December 2020, and I have proof of that. And it's also varies even inside the EU. There are countries inside the EU that are more able and capable to comply with the UDR in the sense that they are able to track imports arriving from many places in the world. So I think the confusion that there is within UDR with small farmers and farmers, and even in several cultures, it's regarding the data need. What do we need to do in order to comply with this regulation? Okay, we know that we cannot deforest after December 2020. That's clear cut. How do we prove that? We have satellite imagery to prove that. That's not enough. We need tracking. We need due diligence. That is, okay, I have a small farm producing corn in Mato Grosso. Do I need someone to come here and sign something for me? Who bears the cost of it? It's the small farmer, it's the European Union. I've seen many people saying that the European Union will bear the cost of the UDR. I frankly don't know who's going to bear the cost of the UDR. It might be the small producers, it might be the coffee producers, the soybean producers, and we're talking about different scales here too. We're talking about, for instance, I come from a region in Brazil, Minas Gerais, which is a producer of coffee. My father produces coffee in about 8 hectares of land. This is really small when compared to soybeans when we have 300 hectares, 400 hectares, 500 hectares. So we are talking about different dimensions and how this regulation will try to fit to this. And my guess it's not going to fit at all. That's not what the UDR is. But I think the producers that we have interviewed in our paper were really upfront about it. Okay, we don't understand how this regulation talk to us. They require something from us, and how can we overcome this? Overcome in a good sense. Overcome, like, how can we comply with this regulation terms in order to export to the European Union?
What do you think to the criticism that the EU is sort of practicing green protectionism, quote? Do you think that has any truth to it?
A green protectionism is it's technically different from environmentally minded regulation. So how can UDR be considered green protectionist? If the UDR was like, okay, we bar imports from Brazil and central forested areas after December to 2020, and there's no way around. It's a blanket veto, I would say. It's just like a banishment of imports. That would be green protection because you're using an environmental argument to close your market. The UDR and CBAM are not exactly this type of blanket closing of a market. That's not how this is working. However, I feel like sometimes farmers and both in our studies and by what I gather in my by talking to people here in Brazil, by talking to farmers here in Brazil, is that this regulation does not communicate clearly to those farmers. And this is also putting in strain and its ability to actually having an effect of being enforced because the UDR was postponed once again, just as I said before. And what can you make this postponement not happening? How can we stop that? Because complaints from both sides of the Atlantic and also from Asia, from Africa. So there's something interesting and also curious about how legislation seems not to work. It's a good regulation, but it feels like, okay, why is it taking so much time for it to have an effect?
Yes, it's definitely interesting and curious for sure, in terms of the timeline there as well for it. Yeah, interesting point there about it not being a blanket regulation. It doesn't have to be a one size fits all across everybody, but yeah, at this point, it's very hard to communicate how it could be otherwise. Talking of scale, big and small powers in this. With the current situation of the US and China playing such big roles in trade, global trade, the EU is still one of Latin America's biggest trading partners. I mean, we've just seen Mercosur, EU-Mercosur agreement developed this month. We're recording in January, I should say, January 2026. In a world where global trade seems to be fragmenting, do you think EU-LAC trade agreements can still bring real benefits to both sides? And does the Brussels effect, that spread of EU rules that we spoke of earlier, make that kind of cooperation easier or harder?
Yes, definitely. I think it's really interesting talking about this at this point of this month because I used to say to my professors, to people who work with me that 2 years ago, 1 year ago, we were in the world of post-tariff reality. We didn't have we were not attacking tariffs. We were attacking EUDR, CBAM regulations. We were aiming at fostering connection, trading services. We were aiming about building fast consensus about this really high level topics in trade. We're not dealing with tariffs. And all of a sudden, last year, we kind of made the opposite direction. And by I'm saying like the United States of America made the opposite direction. I think and we are in the post-tariff world. All of a sudden, tariffs matter a lot. Trade agreements become the fastest way to achieve better exchange terms for countries. But that's a very economist answer in a kind of way. I think that looking into the European Union and the Mercosur, it's really important to mention two aspects. Of course, for European Union, it's really interesting to have partners in the Mercosur and the Latin America because the European Union is under attack by President Donald Trump, by United States right now. And also for Latin America and Mercosur, and particularly for Brazil, it's really interesting to have a stronger connection with the European Union in the sense of, okay, we're not only under the influence of the United States, because Brazil likes to project itself as a regional power. And if it gets isolated by the United States cloud over the Western Hemisphere, it means that that's not possible. In a world of hegemons, there are not regional powers. That's those concepts do not align themselves. And I take like the invasion of the United States in Venezuela and the threats to invade Greenland are exactly bothersome for many countries because there are many applications. This is not something, a question that bothers European Union, China, Russia, Brazil. It's India. It's relevant for several countries. However, and literature is plentiful in saying that trade agreements can induce peace in a sense that you make countries' connections stronger, so they have the cost to fight each other is higher. Trade also benefit economies usually. The increased growth, the increased employment, the increased productivity, even though there might be some losses in non-competitive sectors. And also, and I think the first part of my answer here, it's trade is a geopolitical instrument. And I want to say instrument because it can be either like a gun. If you don't comply with my requirements, I will tariff you 10%. Oh, did you comply with my requirements? I'm taking the tariffs down. And also this geopolitical aspect comes into place about peacekeeping, I would say, like in the sense of, okay, we are not fighting each other because we're too connected economically and trade. So there's a lot to lose by fighting. In the case of the EU-Mercosur, it's really relevant to say that this trade agreement was being negotiated for a quarter of a century, so that's a lot of time. And it took a lot of effort from several players across the Atlantic, both in the European Union and the Mercosur side, for the agreement to materialize. I don't think this trade agreement is completely said and done because there's still need for parliament approvals and both sides of the Atlantic. However, within the concept of the Brussels effect is exactly this power of Brussels, the European Union, to diffuse regulation through market means. When I diffuse regulation through market means, basically we can engage in a market, we can exchange goods, services, and any type of product. If you do that, if you have this regulation, if you do this thing the way I do, this is not the European Union saying to Brazil, okay, you need to have this piece of law in your constitution. That's not Brussels effect. Brussels effect is a little more subtle, but it's a lot more powerful because it gets more powerful, gets more effective, the higher the degree of connection among the economies. So the EU-Mercosur trade agreement will tend to increase the Brussels effect in Brazil, and this is already happening in some other aspects in Brazil, at least, that I can test prior the European Union Mercosur trade agreement signing. So, for instance, in Brazil, we have this huge policy of rural credit, and the central bank, Brazilian central bank, responsible for regulating this policy, forbids deforestation after 2019 July. So, rural credit cannot go to farmers that deforested after this date. So in a way, this is very EUDR-like, right? EUDR is about not deforesting after December 2020, and the rural credit in Brazil from 2026 moving forward won't be able to lend money to farmers that deforested after July 2019. This is the kind of diffusion effect of regulation that the Brussels effect is about. It's already happening. It's already happening prior the European Union Mercosur trade agreement signing. Signing is not the proper term. It's when it come into effect, when it's ratified by all countries. So in a way, the EU Mercosur trade agreement, it means more power to the European Union. Something that I think we might want to look into the future. It's how the opposite channel might operate. Of course, the European Union is much more stronger, and the Brussels effect is this really powerful concept because one of the characteristics of the European Union for the Brussels effect to work is that the European Union is willing to regulate. So the European Union is really a big agent, and it has the ability, the know-how, and it knows how to regulate. This is not a trivial aspect of how the European Union works.
Policies like CBAM and EUDR are meant to promote sustainability, but they also affect how other countries trade with Europe. From your point of view, can these mechanisms really achieve a balance between economic growth, environmental protection, even social inclusion, especially in the Latin American context you've mentioned there?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question because I think when people think about sustainability and environmental policies, they usually think, okay, we're gonna help to build huge areas of solar panels. We're gonna build huge wind farms. We're gonna build water plants, several across the countries. However, sustainability is also really constant, coherent with equality and inclusion. So, for instance, how do we measure that? How do you know that? Because we know that the current state where in the situation in which we are emitting a lot of CO2, we are burning oil, we're deforesting. They're not equality inducing in a sense. So I think we are able to increase sustainability and reduce inequality by just being mindful of the inequality of the current economic system in terms of emissions. We're not in a situation in which equality is good, at least here in Brazil. I know there are many countries in Europe in which inequality is really low, and that's really interesting. And those countries, the Nordic countries, also happen to be relatively sustainable. My message is there is not a contradiction, but we have two different goals. And when you have several objectives to achieve, it becomes harder to move towards the three of them at the same time. So you want economic growth, sustainability, and equality. How can we make them not contradict themselves? We know that trade usually it's an inducer of growth. We also have, for instance, trade agreements growing the numbers of environmental provisions. Even the European Union Mercosur trade agreement has some provisions regarding environmental questions such as deforestation. And this is also moved in equality in a different direction, which is interesting and necessary for us to achieve a better, a true development, not just economic growth. The European Union has had and has a large role to play in this. It's a really powerful agent for regulating. There's a difficulty in balancing these three things, but they're definitely attainable. Or at least I'm optimistic enough to believe that.
Oh, I really love your optimism. And yeah, certainly talking of things that are in the spirit of kind of contradictory, but also in a more positive light, complementary
Yes.
partnerships. Europe and Latin America have often been portrayed as having very different positions on trade and environmental issues. But of course, we've just had this EU-Mercosur agreement this month, which is, yeah, a really exciting development in that partnership. But given the differences, which are hopefully complementary, do you see room for common ground and a way to strengthen trade while advancing environmental goals that both sides will agree on and have agreed on, in fact?
Yeah, last November we had the Conference of Parties happening in Belém, in Brazil. It was not as good as we expected, but I think the way to go to move forward is really to have these ambitious goals and to work towards them. And the European Union is doing this. It's doing this with the EUDR, the CBAM. The European Union, it's not expecting the WTO approval, the United States approval, the I don't know, China approval. And there's also some regulations happening in Brazil, especially with rural credit and forest code, that also aims to decrease illegal deforestation, decreases emissions. Brazil energetic matrix is already quite clean, although it's really heavily reliant on water, which is not necessarily the best green energy. But the more important things already happening. We're talking the same language. The European Union and Latin and Mercosur and Brazil are already talking the same language. The goals are aligned so far. They haven't been aligned in the previous government, but I feel this is an exercise of trial and error about what regulation works, what regulation doesn't work. We talked about CBAM and EUDR earlier today. I feel they might work, they might not work. It's really important to align expectations with this, especially EUDR, because they are complex regulations. They put a lot of stress on the supply chain in order to comply with this regulation. Their effect might be small, but we don't know yet because the UDR was postponed once again. So it's really about a willingness to negotiate, to talk. I feel very always optimistic about the future. So how do you and Latin are able to communicate and to solve the environmental questions? And we have these larger bodies, social conference parties, UNFCCC, that can help to communicate better. We also have other non necessarily environmental forums that can help gather momentum for this UDR and CBAM regulations, such WTO, which is not an organization that has been activated by UDR regarding the power of the right the European Union to regulate. Although the World Trade Organization has decided in favor of the European Union last year. The European Union barring the imports of goods from Indonesia and Malaysia due to Indonesia and Malaysia trying to cheat the European Union regulation in the first station. So that was really curious decision by WTO. So in a sense, it feels at the times that we're not moving towards the same direction, but I think the European Union and Mercosur are definitely talking the same language.
Well, absolutely. And well, I think we're going to have to touch base with you in about a year to see where we're at and what the EUDR actually looks like at that point to hopefully have more of your optimism. And well, thank you very much. Thank you. It's been really wonderful to hear from you and to learn from you. When is your paper maybe going to be ready? No pressure. So we can also link that in the podcast
Yeah.
description.
Thanks for having me, Emily. It was a pleasure talking to you about those topics. A group of colleagues of mine are writing a paper about the facts of UDR on land use and deforestation with a focus on Brazilian municipalities. We're expecting to have a working paper version available by the next March.
we'll make sure once that's ready, once there's a link, that will be in the podcast description for our listeners. And well, thank you again. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard today, check out all of our episodes available on SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. We have episodes in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Or follow us online. We would love to hear from you. We're on X, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Head to www.eulas.network to find out more. Thank you. Gracias. Obrigada.